Our favourite consultant paediatrician, Dr. Dewi Evans, has been making some new comments about the Lucy Letby case. Now, I'm not going to publicise the article in which these were published because I think the journalist has essentially done something quite unethical, but you can find these comments online if you wish to do so. So, the first thing that Dr. Evans has said in this article is the case against Letby is stronger now than it was when she was convicted. Now, if we were going to look at the hit parade of stupid comments from Dr. Dewi Evans, this could be his number one hit of all the stupid comments that he's ever made. Now, I can't say that with complete conviction because there have been so many other stupid comments that he's made, but it's fairly extraordinary for anyone to claim that the case against Letby is stronger now than it was when she was convicted. Of course, in order for that to be the case, there would need to be new evidence that had come up that made her seem more guilty than she was at the time she was convicted. Of course, we know that hasn't happened, but we'll look at that at the end of this section. What we do know for certain is that many things have come up that point to either this being an unsafe conviction or just outright innocence. So let's just go through some of those before we look at the essentially one single thing that has come up that could possibly justify this statement that the case against Letby is stronger now than it was when she was convicted. So, firstly, we now know that this case was passed to the police with no evidence. Now, I'd like to go into this in more detail, and I will be going into this in very great detail. At the moment, I can't discuss the police and the context around that for reasons that I can't go into, but I will eventually go into this in some depth. But I can just confirm here that we know when this case was passed to Cheshire Police, there was no evidence whatsoever. This sole prosecution case is entirely founded on the basis of Dr. Dewi Evans and the stuff that he concocted over the 5 years that he worked with Cheshire Police. In addition, we know that a series of reports were ignored by the court. They were not part of the court process, they were not shown to the jury, most notably the RCPCH report, which you can see on the screen now. We also know that pathologist and coroner reviews were overturned, and we know that experts have since given explanations that either coincide or correlate with several of these reviews. This was again not communicated satisfactorily to the court during the court case. The next thing that we now know, and this was touched upon in court but not discussed in a satisfactory fashion, was that sepsis was endemic on this unit. Now, in previous videos, I've discussed why sepsis is particularly troubling and particularly problematic for what are vulnerable infants, very vulnerable infants, in the case of neonates. I'm not going to go into this again in this video, but 9 of the 17 infants on that unit were now known to be septic. And that has many knock-on consequences in terms of infection and the potential outcome for the children. It was acknowledged in the court case that there was raw sewage running on the unit. So that isn't something that is new. Obviously, it's very troubling. And I do believe that we've seen a great deal more context for that revelation than was properly conveyed in court. However, we have learned something about sewage that I will go over in this exchange between journalist John Sweeney and Dr. Evans himself. So this is some discussion between John Sweeney and Dewi Evans that occurred in episode 4, I believe, of the podcast series that was made by John Sweeney and Edward Abel Smith. And this episode is called Star Witness. It begins here with some discussion that regarding something I already mentioned, regarding the kind of endemic outbreak of sepsis on the unit. and some issues related to pneumonia, and some contextual issues related to another infant who fell very sick and recovered at another hospital. And John Sweeney goes on to explain that infection can kill a baby, even though the physical signs of that infection may not be obvious. And then Dr. Evans is probably trying to interrupt him, so he says, bear with me, pneumonia is a subset of sepsis. Yes, it's an infection. Yes. So, but actually, if we're looking at 4 babies, 1 baby doesn't die and 1 baby survives, but 4 in June 2015, 3 of them have sepsis, including baby C. So it's possible another scenario is that there is not a murderer. This is a badly run unit, and also there's a sewage problem. Dr. Evans says, as far as the sewage problem is concerned, I don't know when this occurred. If there was a sewage problem, it would not explain what caused the death of these babies. So we'll rewind to that in a second. I can tell you there is a sewage problem which is consistent. The plumber, the only witness for the defence, said there was a weekly problem in the neonatal unit they had to attend weekly. There was a log of Pseudomonas in the taps, and they fixed it for one tap and not the other. And this is in May 2015. The next month, there are 4 babies that have sepsis. So is it possible that this is a badly run unit and there is a sewage problem, and the sewage means there is killer bacteria in the taps? They found Pseudomonas in 2 taps in the unit, right? They didn't know about the raw sewage in the unit. They didn't know about the killer bacteria. And none of us knew about that as far as I know. Yes, but it's interesting though, isn't it? Isn't it noteworthy? I mean, we asked one former neonatal doctor how many units he'd worked on where there had been raw sewage, and he said, never, never. I mean, was it in your unit? Good God, no. Good God, no. Would you, if there was a raw sewage leak, what would you have done? It would have been sorted. We would have closed the unit down. We would have demanded that the management sort out the problem together, sort the plumbing out, would not admit any babies until it was dealt with. So there are a few things to note about this exchange, why this is significant to mention. Firstly, Dr. Evans seemingly claims that he didn't even know about the sewage. Now, he could have contacted the hospital. He's also stated elsewhere that he never contacted anyone from the hospital, he never got details from the hospital, etc., etc. There is actually a Sky News interview where he says that he's made this comment in court as well. He's made this comment since, but there is a Sky News interview where he says that contextual information about the hospital was not available. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that he was in court when sewage was discussed, and when other things were discussed that he used to say that Lucy Letby is guilty, he changed his opinion in court. Whereas when sewage was mentioned, he never took that into consideration, and he never changed his opinion to say, you know what, there's very clear signs of sepsis. There's a link between sewage and sepsis. There's Pseudomonas there as well. I don't know if actually, to be fair, if there was knowledge of Pseudomonas, although there should have been, as I'll reveal in future videos. I can't remember. I think I may have discussed this previously, but I'll probably do a standalone video on it at some point as well. But he, when he heard from the plumber and he heard about the sewage problems, he didn't change his opinion then. He only changed his opinion on other things. Of course, this is something we know about now that we didn't know about at the time of the trial. And then thirdly here, he's obviously made this admission that the unit should have been shut down immediately. And, I'll give him credit. He's very, very explicit about the seriousness of sewage being on the unit. But to be fair, if he was going to be taken seriously as a paediatrician, he'd have to say that, because obviously you don't need any medical knowledge to know that there shouldn't be sewage on a neonatal unit. So overall, this is a whole new raft of context related to the sewage that didn't come out in court, and it gives us a completely different perspective on that information, and it simply makes the guilt of Lucy Letby look far more doubtful. It's not so, as he suggested, the prosecution case is supposedly stronger now, and that there's more evidence against Lucy Letby. But here's yet another example of a piece of evidence that makes the prosecution look weaker and make the prosecution and conviction of Lucy Letby appear significantly more doubtful. As I just mentioned, another thing that we know much more about now is the presence of Pseudomonas, the bacteria Pseudomonas, on the ward, which is listed by the World Health Organization as one of the most dangerous bacteria, particularly for young and vulnerable infants, as were based on this unit that counts to Chester. And then in addition to that, there's also Stenotrophomonas multifilia that the panel has now pointed to another bacteria, another extremely dangerous presence for young infants, particularly vulnerable neonates. In addition to that, we know that assertions that were made in court by Dr. Evans about infants not being infected and infection not being significant are just simply plain wrong. Additionally, the shift chart that was presented in court is now known to be completely deficient. It is known that there are at least 10 incidents, and probably more, in which Lucy Letby is either not on duty, not present, or cannot conceivably have committed any of the acts that she's supposed to have carried out. The logistics of it are simply impossible, and sometimes she's not even in the hospital or even anywhere near the infants that are supposed to have been harmed deliberately. In addition, we know that the children that appeared in the court case were very significantly more ill than was presented to the jury. The jury was given the impression that an infant was recovering, an infant was in good shape. Essentially, the word stable was used a lot. That seems to me quite systematic and quite deliberate, because that gives stability, gives the impression of something that is not under any threat. We associate the term stability or stable with something that is very sound, but in medical terms, it has a completely different meaning. It is possible that some of these infants were stable, but that does not mean that they weren't unwell, and it does not mean that their collapse was entirely unexpected. It's very, very clear now that numerous infants in this court case were far more ill than was ever presented in court. Since the court case took place, claims made by Dr. Evans in court have also been widely ridiculed. There's just one example on the screen now from the Guardian newspaper, but we've also seen this from other neonatologists and other paediatric experts, particularly commenting in Private Eye. We now know as well that there are big problems with the insulin testing and readings that were presented in court, particularly for the 999 reading related to glucose, which simply must be an error. Other assertions related to insulin are also plain wrong, and I've already begun my series of videos on that topic and will delve into it in much more depth in future videos as well. In fact, my next published video is going to be on the insulin cases. We know that proper testing had not been conducted at the hospital with relation to numerous aspects of this court case, and I've exposed this in previous videos, is simply undeniable. I have one example of that on the screen currently. Numerous aspects of the court case are now known to be incorrect. The jury heard scientific information that is simply palpably wrong. There is another example of that on the screen currently. We now have a very good idea of how poor the cross-examination of Dr. Evans was in court. He maintains, and he will reference this quite frequently, that his opinions were tested during the court case. Well, that's absolutely true, but he seems to think that because there was a conviction that he performed well in court. He did not perform well in court. There were numerous moments where his performance was an absolute train wreck. The only reason that a conviction was actually secured was because the court case was so unfair and the process that occurred was so fundamentally flawed. I would firstly say in any kind of reasonable court case, his evidence would not have been convincing. And secondly, up against the experts that are in the panel now, he would just have absolutely no chance whatsoever. We now know that Dr. Evans changed his opinion before, during, and after the court case. And obviously this is a matter of significant concern. He has literally disowned diagnoses that were expressed in court, and it's virtually impossible for him to actually speak now because he's tied himself in such an array of knots with the contradictory statements that he's made that it's literally impossible for him to answer questions objectively. As I've discussed in previous videos, and as is well known, the Lee and Tanswell paper that is on the screen now, co-authored by Dr. Xu Li, has become an extremely important aspect of this court case because it was used as the sole diagnostic source, and now Dr. Shu Lee has trashed the science that was used in the court case and the conclusions and hypotheses of Dr. Evans. This is extremely significant because it was a hugely important factor in the court case, and frankly, without the injection of air hypothesis that was a central feature, a central pillar of the prosecution case, it becomes very much unfounded. The injection of air, the injection of air hypothesis has been very much rubbished since the court case took place, and now the diagnosis of Dr. Evans, so-called that. Actually, let me get this straight. There are no diagnoses in this court case. Dr. Evans did not diagnose a single thing. Dr. Evans put hypotheses into the court case. We should never describe what he did in this court case as a diagnosis. It's not a diagnosis. It's an unprovable, untested, unmeasured, spurious theory. And that's why it's falling apart, and that's why it's being ridiculed, and that's why he's tying himself in knots, because there never was a diagnosis in the first place. He changed all these things away now as well from the idea that air was injected into the stomach of infants via a nasogastric tube. Unfortunately and inconveniently, this is mentioned with regard to several infants in the case in the Court of Appeal verdict. Recently, Dr. Evans has started trying to introduce milk into the case in an attempt to buttress his theories that he's put forward that have now been completely discredited. But this was never relied on in court. There was only one infant for which they even mentioned milk. I've put information from the cross-examination on the screen previously. It was an absolute disaster for Dr. Evans because he couldn't maintain his position on that, even under just questioning from Ben Myers with no other medical input. If there'd been other medical input, he just would have looked absolutely ridiculous. But now, because he's written to Channel 5, because the air down the nasogastric tube has been absolutely rubbished, because he looks like a total idiot, he's had to start saying, oh yeah, Lucy destabilised the infants with milk, even though he never said that in court, only in relation to one infant. And that case is absolutely farcical, and when he was cross-examined on that case, he was made to look like an utter buffoon. We now know that Dr. Jairam gave a false account of events in relation to child K because emails have come out that are featured in the Unheard article that's on the screen now, which indicate very clearly that he previously gave a completely different version of events. In the case of the swipe card data that was involved in court, we know that this is incorrect for 9 infants in the case, and furthermore that there was a staircase in the unit into one of the nurseries which didn't require smart card entry in order to get into the unit. So any swipe card data in relation to that nursery is completely unreliable. It was explained to me that you could be shown as present in that nursery when you were actually across the road in a pub. It's that ridiculous and it's that unreliable. In fact, we also know that the prosecution essentially lied about swipe card data and Datix information in the court case because they contradicted their own arguments. There is an instance in which Lucy Letby made a comment about, I'm in this nursery at this time, and Nick Johnson said to her, well, someone could have sneaked in behind you. So that actually applies to all of the swipe card data that was used in court, and indeed the entire prosecution case. Nick Johnson was fundamentally arguing against the entire prosecution case by making that statement. And the same occurred with Datix information, where the prosecution accused Lucy Letby of fabricating entries, although they never provided any evidence to support this whatsoever, let alone any proof. Furthermore, we also know that there was no obstetric information analysed in the court case, and I'll return to that point a little later in this video. As I've discussed many times on this channel, we now know there was no genetic testing done on any of these children. The standard testing generally was very poor, but there was literally no genetic testing. Dr. Evans claimed that the air embolism theory that he came up with was not a diagnosis of exclusion, but he has since claimed otherwise and made numerous statements which indicate that it clearly was a diagnosis of exclusion. At this point, Dr. Evans has contradicted himself so many times that it would be impossible for him to disentangle the knots of his opinions. This is why he never gives substantial interviews anymore or never answers any direct questions in any kind of meaningful way, because it is literally impossible without him contradicting something else that he said previously. One of the reasons that Dr. Evans has come under scrutiny has been the publicising of comments made by a trial judge, Lord Justice Jackson, in which he described evidence provided by Dr. Evans as worthless. This was also sent to the trial judge in the Letby case, Lord Justice Goss, but in his wisdom, he decided to completely ignore this opinion. Other court cases that Dr. Evans have been involved in are also highly dubious. We know of at least 3 other court cases in which we see similar patterns of behaviour to the Letby case. The supposed confession note that Lucy Letby wrote, we now know to have been written as part of a counselling exercise involving Catherine de Bager. There is also a blue post-it note which hasn't been particularly publicised, which I won't go over in this video because I'm going to discuss this in a future video, in which Lucy writes several comments which are either exculpatory or indicate innocence. We now know about numerous other deaths related to the Countess of Chester that occurred on the neonatal unit and that were investigated by police. In total, there were 18 deaths across the period that Lucy Letby worked, and 17 of these were investigated by Cheshire Police. It's not really entirely clear why they didn't investigate the 18th death, because they investigated several incidents in which Lucy Letby was not present when the child died, either due to it being in another hospital or her not being on duty. This also occurred with infants that are not included in the document that is on your screen now, including child K, where Lucy Letby was charged with attempted murder for a child that died 3 days later in a completely different hospital. Initially, the prosecution wanted to charge Lucy with actual murder for that infant, even though it died three days later, 3 days after she had any contact with the infant whatsoever in a completely different hospital. Finally, there are serious problems with the police investigation that I cannot discuss at this juncture, but this will definitely be revealed soon. So let's look at the new evidence that has come out that has strengthened the conviction since the court case took place. So there was this allegation made about tube extubations. Now, even the tube extubation that occurred in the court case looks unbelievably shaky. That's the most generous statement you could possibly make. Been discredited to the point of having no merit whatsoever, in fact. These tube extubations have similarly been discredited, not least by Dr. Jairam himself, but as we see on the screen, just essentially ridiculed from day one, and it's gone very quiet on that subject. We also have these 4,000 cases the Cheshire Police were supposedly investigating, and they've gone terribly quiet about those, although they have ruled out 3,998 of them. I can't say this definitively, but I can't help thinking that this supposed ongoing investigation is just a shield they can hide behind so that they don't have to answer any questions. So, on reflection, the statement made by Dr. Evans that the prosecution case is now stronger than at the time of the court case, I'm doubtful that even he could possibly believe this, but it's a statement of such utter stupidity that it's really difficult to know how to describe it. I think overall his statements here, in this particular article, we have to remember that this is a nearly 80-year-old man who's supposed to be an expert witness. It's kind of like a 13-year-old who's been dissed on Facebook or Twitter, just lashing out like a child. It's just quite extraordinary, really. Um, and to make a statement like that the prosecute, you know, I've said previously, and I do think there's an element of this. I just don't think he understands that, on the internet people look things up, and when you say things, they're on the internet forever, and they don't just disappear into a memory hole. And even if you put like I've seen these things with famous people where they put something slightly dubious on Twitter for a very short period of time, then delete it, but it's way too late by then. Okay, you're not as famous as those people, but when you just make quotes that go into newspaper articles and go into podcasts, they're just there forever. And even if they get deleted, people have long since captured the podcast and long since captured what you said, and you can't double back on yourself. I do think this is partly because he's been this witness in family courts, which are much less scrutinised, but I can't see any other possible explanation. Obviously, he's a very immature person. Obviously, he's a very arrogant person. That's crystal clear. But I just think perhaps he just thinks, I can just say anything. People will just read that and then it'll all be okay. Not realising that the internet just does not work like that. So now Dr. Evans moves on to his second inspired statement. I had never heard of Roger Norwich until recently, which suggests he hadn't played a prominent role in cases of this kind. I don't know what expertise he has. So there are several things to bring up here. Firstly, Dr. Evans just seems to think he's the arbiter of everything. Like he will say, oh, I've personally never heard of him. Or, other comments have been made and Dr. Evans will go, I'd be happy to look at the reports. No one's asked you. No one's asked you to look at the reports. Why on earth would anyone care what you think? Like, okay, I've never heard of have you heard of what percentage of paediatricians in the country have you heard of? What percentage, I doubt you'd heard of a large percentage when you actually worked in Wales. But given that you haven't worked in a hospital for 20 years, why on earth would you have heard of every paediatrician in the country? That's the first thing to raise. The second thing is, this is very indicative of the sort of cronyism that occurs in this kind of network of people that work in the National Crime Agency who become expert witnesses in court. Essentially what he's saying here is, I've never encountered Dr. Roger Norwich as part of the National Crime Agency, so therefore I don't have any regard for what he has to say, or he's not part of the in crowd, or he's not part of the old boys network, you might describe it as. That also kind of brings up troubling notions about his relationship with Dr. Bohin, which, as I've said previously, Dr. Bohin knew him well enough to refer to him by his first name. The third thing I'd like to say is that Dr. Roger Norwich's expertise, as he puts it, is at the very least equal to his because he's a paediatrician. I would suggest it's superior to his for several reasons, but at the very least, he has the same level of expertise as Dr. Evans. This comment also rather overlooks the fact that considerably more qualified people in the shape of the expert panel have also been highly critical of what Dr. Evans did. But he does move on now to discuss the international panel, as he describes it. That seems to be like a slight, they're not from Wales like me, they're from all over the place. The international panel, which claimed none of the babies had been murdered, did not include a pathologist, a haematologist, a radiologist, an endocrinologist, or an obstetrician. And then the very bold statement that all of the panel's conclusions are wrong. Well, we'll see about that. But as he's provided absolutely no further information whatsoever about why he's able to say definitively that all of the panel's conclusions are wrong, we can't really assess that in any more depth. But we can literally take apart the other assertions that he's made in this particular statement. So firstly, with regard to the obstetrics, this blog appeared recently from this Emeritus Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Nottingham, who had been a consultant obstetrician until just last year when he retired. And this gentleman has begun to look at issues related to the obstetrics, and that's particularly interesting. So in this article, this obstetrician points out many problems with this court case. And then the last few paragraphs, he says, in the meantime, although almost all doctors I've discussed the case with have serious doubts, relatively few have come out publicly in Letby's defence. The reason is probably that few working doctors have time to read all the details, and it's risky publicly defending a convicted child killer. One of the few practicing neonatologists to speak out has had people complain about her to the GMC and to her employer. I retired last year, so I've got the time and don't really care if people write to the GMC about me, but I'm not a neonatologist, not even a paediatrician, so what can I add? I was an NHS obstetrician for over 40 years and in clinical practice in 2015 to 16 when the events unfolded. Since no obstetrician appears to have commented on the case in detail, I'm going to try and fill in the gaps and focus on the maternal aspects, the obstetrics. And essentially, his focus is that the obstetrics were not addressed in any legitimate or meaningful way in the initial court case. But I'm going to go over the next article that he wrote in some detail. So this is the second article from this obstetrician where we've seen this table before from the Court of Appeal verdict. I've reproduced it many times on this channel, where he goes through the chronology and the mechanisms alleged for the babies concerned. And there's some more information here about the actual verdict. So here the obstetrician writes, in summary, Letby was convicted of using 7 or possibly 8 different methods to attack babies. Embolus 7 times, air via nasogastric tube 3 times, overfeeding with milk twice but both on the same baby, insulin poisoning twice, throat trauma once, injury to liver once, dislodged endotracheal tube once, gastric trauma using a rigid medical tool once. This last method is my interpretation, based on the BBC reports at the time, of what the appeal court meant by acute bleeding for baby E. Acute bleeding seems more a mechanism of death than a mechanism of murder. And then he talks a little about Shuley and the international panel and how they've numbered the infants as opposed to using the original lettering system. Talks more about staff anonymity, neonatal unit levels that we discussed in this channel already. And then he goes on to say, in 2015 to 16, the period of Letby's crimes, the Council of Chester was classified as a local neonatal level 2 unit. In July 2016, when Letby was removed from direct clinical duties, never to return, it was downgraded to a special care level 1 unit. That's enough background. Tomorrow I'll make a start, taking each mother in turn. First the mother of twins, 1/A and 2/B. Jim Thornton. Now, this is never going to happen because obstetrician Jim Thornton is now involved in the defence. So he won't be publishing this blog, unfortunately. I was going to cover this probably in future videos, but now it will just be part of the defence. So that immediately puts to bed the idea that there isn't an obstetrician in the defence, because there now definitely is, even if there wasn't one previously, which probably is quite a flawed assumption because we don't know everyone that's in the defence. But also it should be emphasised as well that in the original court case, Dr. Evans had made absolutely no effort to go into the obstetric history of the mothers, and that played absolutely no role whatsoever in any of his verdicts. So for him to actually pick up the defence on the idea there isn't obstetric work and there isn't an obstetrician involved is, I would say, I would describe it as completely hypocritical, but at best it's quite flawed, let's say that. So to return to the comments of Dr. Evans, he next accuses the panel of not having a pathologist. Now, this shows a bit of a dearth of research from Dr. Evans, because on the second page of one of the panel documents is a reference, it's included in the index as well, I should emphasise, is the biography of Dr. Marta Cohen, OBE, MD, FRC Path, DMG Pathol, Dip Med Ed. Now, you can see pretty quickly from DMG Pathol that that's going to look very much like she's a pathologist, which of course she is. So I'll read her biography. Dr. Marta Cohen is a paediatric and perinatal pathologist, also trained as forensic pathologist. She graduated from La Plata Medical School in Argentina and was trained in paediatrics histopathology and forensic and legal medicine in Buenos Aires in South Africa, and in forensic pathology in Sheffield, UK, and holds the FRC Path UK. She is currently a consultant and paediatric and perinatal pathologist and head of the Department of Histopathology at the Sheffield Children's Hospital NHS FT, as well as Honorary Professor of Paediatric Pathology at the University of Sheffield School of Medicine and Population Health Division of Clinical Medicine. Dr. Cohen's research focuses on aspects of use of post-mortem magnetic resonance and PM-CT scan as adjuvant to traditional post-mortem, investigation of sudden infant death syndrome and sudden death in childhood, something Dr. Evans could look up, considering that he thinks no infant should ever die suddenly for an unexplained reason. Investigation of stillborn and preterm delivery and gastrointestinal paediatric pathology. Her publications include 7 books in print, 36 chapters in print and 2 in press, and 172 peer-reviewed journals in print. In addition, it says I have, obviously that should be written as she has 28 peer-referred conference papers in print press. Dr. Cohen has received numerous awards, including ESC Mid Fellow in 2025, the illustrious Visitant awarded by the city of La Plata, Argentina in 2022, the Bronze Clinical Excellent NHS-CAA Award in 2021, the Compassionate Care Award at Sheffield Children's NHS FT in 2021, the Order of the British Empire in 2020, the Pathologist 2019 Trailblazers Power List in 2019, recognition in the book The First 50 Years of the European Society of Pathology, Minds, Microscopes and Molecules by Andrew Wilson, the Power List of Most Influential Pathologists, in 2015 the BMG Award, Minimally Invasive Autopsy in 2015, and Sheffield Ambassador since 2015. So I think we can quite firmly put to bed the idea that there isn't a pathologist in the international panel. I also happen to know that there's another pathologist that is available to the panel as well. Oh, can I just mention as well, while we're on the subject of pathologists, of course, Dr. Evans completely overruled all the pathologists and coroners from the original court case, so he obviously doesn't hold pathology in a particularly high esteem, generally. The next comment from Dr. Evans is that there's no endocrinologist in the panel. Now, given that there's an enormous document on the insulin cases with absolutely loads of comments on endocrinology, this seemed like a fairly unlikely suggestion immediately. So in the panel is Dr. Adil Ismail, PhD, FRC Pathology, retired consultant in clinical biochemistry and chemical endocrinology, Director of Pathology Services, member of Mid Yorkshire Trust Board, and honorary senior lecturer at Leeds Medical School. Relevant experience, endocrinology and chromatography. Extensive research and publications on endocrinology with specialisation in chromatography techniques, including gas liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry. Pioneered immunoassay methods and development before commercialization, including antibody production, specificity evaluation, and method validation. This allowed me to have in-depth understanding of immunoassay limitations and analytical errors, which is crucial in ensuring diagnostic accuracy. Medical error analysis and publications. Authored the largest and only prospective study assessing immunoassay errors in over 5,000 patients. Published over 100 peer-reviewed papers. Book, Biochemical Investigations in Endocrinology, Methods and Interpretation. My contribution and publications on this subject exceeded those of many peers and are recognised internationally, particularly in immunoassay error analysis and endocrine diagnostics. And then Charles Stanley, MD, Professor of Paediatrics Emeritus, we see his biography here as well. Paediatric endocrinologist, Emeritus Professor, CE of Pediatrics, Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Internationally recognised expertise in hypoglycemia diseases of newborns, infants and children, including inborn errors of metabolism, hyperinsulinism and other endocrine disorders. Previous service at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia as attending endocrinologist. Chief of Division of Endocrinology and Diabetes, Clinical Research Center Core Laboratory Director and Director of Hyperinsulinism Center. Experience as expert witness for medico-legal cases for both plaintiffs and defendants, testifying at depositions and trial. Author of over 200 original articles and chapters on hypoglycemia disorders in children, dealing with diagnosis and treatment, disease mechanisms, and genetics. Co-author of Pediatric Endocrine Society Guidelines for Diagnosis and Treatment of Hypoglycemia and Guidelines for Diagnosis and Treatment of Congenital Hyperinsulinism. published original research on management of transitional neonatal hypoglycemia and perinatal stress induced hyperinsulinism and on biochemical mechanism of hyperinsulinism hypoglycemia in normal and high-risk newborns. So again, I think we can pretty firmly put to bed the idea that there are no endocrinologists on this panel. Now, the next pillar of the brilliant statement of Dr. Evans relates to the fact that there is no radiologist on the panel of international experts. Now, Dr. Evans is not stupid enough to think this is a legitimate statement. This is deliberately disingenuous. Dr. Evans knows very well that the only reason there was a radiologist in the original panel was so that Professor Owen Arthurs could provide some sort of vague support for the batshit theories of Dr. Evans in relation to air embolism. The radiologist didn't get involved in any of the other forms of inflicted harm. They didn't get involved. Professor Arthurs didn't get involved in the insulin cases. He was just purely there to give essentially evidence related to X-rays. Now, this is not needed for the international panel because the international panel don't think any of the infants were harmed by the injection of air into their stomachs. Although, to be fair, Dr. Evans doesn't think that anymore either. So the reason there's no radiologist is because they don't need any evidence from a radiologist, because they don't think the presence of air is significant, because air is significant in lots of infants, and Professor Arthurs said this in the court case. Furthermore, as I've already shown in other videos, and as I'm about to show now, Professor Arthurs did not provide any explicit support for the prosecution case or the theories of Dr. Evans. So we see here on the screen the people that were involved in the prosecution case who, as expert witnesses in the original court case, including Professor Owen Arthurs, consultant paediatric radiologist. So we see some information here, some very critical information that I will read out in full. Professor Arthurs is a consultant paediatric radiologist at Great Ormond Street Hospital. He gave evidence that he would rarely see an air embolus as a cause of death or as a radiological diagnosis because an air embolus sufficient to cause clinical symptoms is usually so massive that the focus of the clinical and nursing team will be on resuscitation and not obtaining imaging. The absence of air does not mean, therefore, that the embolus was not at one time present, as it may well have disappeared by the time that the radiograph is taken. I mean, this, I think, is highly dubious. Anyway, he said that he had undertaken a detailed study or review of 500 cases, 38 of whom were babies under the age of 2 months at the time of death, from Great Ormond Street Hospital, in order to satisfy himself that the finding of the line of gas in one of the large vessels of the body, such as found in baby A, was unusual, as opposed to it being present but overlooked. And then he found the complete opposite. He found that 25% of the babies that are reviewed had gas in the large vessels. Of the 38 babies who were under 2 months of age, he found 8 cases where there was gas in the great vessels, and these babies had died of trauma, sudden expected death in infancy, congenital heart disease, and disseminated malignancy. The detailed review therefore found no unexplained cases of gas in the great vessels. Well, I mean, that's not a very good conclusion. What his detailed review essentially found is that gas in infants is commonplace. It happens all the time, and it's not usually the cause of death, although it can be the cause of death. Again, it's important to emphasize that this air is present accidentally, is present unintentionally. It is not necessarily caused either malignantly or even by medical error. It's just there as an accidental presence. It's nothing to do with any malignant behaviour, and Dr. Evans himself never proposed any mechanism to explain why the air present in the infants was not there accidentally or unintentionally. So I'm not going to read all of this because it goes on and on before making the point that is important anyway. Just simply read the last sentence here, that the gas that was present in these infants was therefore consistent with, but not diagnostic of, air having been administered to baby A. As I mentioned previously, this air can be there accidentally. There's absolutely no reason to believe that it has to be inserted with a syringe, and under normal circumstances, it's not life-threatening. There can be circumstances in which it is, but it has to be an enormously large amount of air. it needs to be a large air embolism. In previous videos, I've shown evidence from Thirlwall documents in which they say, a smaller air embolism is nothing to be concerned about, and a large air embolism will be picked up in the methods mentioned, in X-rays and such like. So then there's more comments here. Professor Arthur's opinion that a post-mortem finding of gas in a great vessel may be attributed to air embolus was not based on any clinical experience and relied upon his own insufficient review of cases. And then it goes on to say here, Professor Arthurs and Dr. Manridis were conspicuously careful not to go further than their specialist expertise will permit them, and emphasise any conclusions to be drawn were for those with clinical experience. The fact that their evidence was not of itself diagnostic of air embolus, blah, 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 because Professor Arthurs never offered any support for a diagnosis of air embolism. All he said was, there is air present in the infants. I did a study and there was air present in many infants. He also said the air can be there accidentally. He couldn't say anything else because it is known to be the case that the air can be there accidentally. Nonetheless, the lack of a so-called presence of a radiologist in the international panel is not an oversight. It's just simply because the international panel did their diagnostic work. They did actual diagnoses based on actual science, not just like thumbing through a few studies and a few research papers until you find something that half fits and then trying to cram all the diagnoses around that. This was actual proper diagnostic, forensic, surgical research from like world-leading experts. And they came to the conclusion that there's no reason whatsoever to believe that air was responsible for any of the illnesses and any of the collapses and any of the deaths in these infants. Therefore, they don't need a radiologist because the radiologist can't do anything useful. That's why there's no radiologist in the panel. Now, the next statement made by Dr. Evans is that there's no haematologist in the panel. Now, there are several things to be said about this. The first one is that Professor Sally Kinsey had an extremely limited role in the court case. So to suggest that the panel have come together, there's this enormous concentration of neonatal and paediatric expertise, plus there are many other experts involved. So that they've done these incredibly detailed reports where they've done this very surgical, focused, forensic medical investigation, and they've come to these very deep, very well expressed, very high standard conclusions, which when you compare what they've written to what Dr. Evans says during the court case, we can't see his reports, but clearly when we hear him speak, when we hear him give his explanations, there's just no comparison. Plus the fact he's on his own, whereas there are dozens of them, whereas he is 95% of the prosecution case, and all these other experts that he keeps citing really performed an extremely minimal role. That's the first thing. The second thing is that aside from the fact that Professor Sally Kinsey had a very small role, and also she was asked about air embolism and she admitted that she couldn't really say anything about it and that the literature is really weak, leaving that aside, she also made this assertion about antiphospholipid syndrome that I've covered in a previous video that was just plainly wrong. So it's known that you need these two tests that are 12 weeks apart. I'll just scroll down and show you all the instances of this being referenced over and over again. It's in the British Haematology Society as well, but you just see it over and over again in all of these links. And the reason for that is that what she said in court in relation to antiphospholipid syndrome is fundamentally incorrect. So citing the opinion of Professor Sally Kinsey by Dr. Evans is not particularly well-founded and not particularly valuable, I would suggest. One final comment I'd like to make about the statement of Dr. Evans is that he's quite obviously pulled some of these remarks from a statement made by Thirlwall lawyers. For example, this one here, that it's notable the panel does not include an obstetrician. Well, it does include an obstetrician, and also we know for a fact, more importantly, obstetrics was absolutely nothing to do with the original court case. Dr. Evans completely, almost entirely disregarded any kind of obstetric data or information. He pretty much disregarded any context at all, other than trying to come to some arcane conclusion that Lucy Letby was guilty. So we learned three significant things from this statement. The first one is that the vast majority of what Dr. Evans has said is factually incorrect. When it isn't factually incorrect, this is because what he has said is irrelevant, specious, or both. The second thing we've learned is that much of what he has said is copied from the statement from Thirlwell lawyers. Now, you can see my playlist here where I've already decimated this statement, so you can go back and look at those videos if you wish to do so. I'll say that we'll also return to this point in a second. The third thing we've learned is that Dr. Evans quite obviously doesn't bother to check whether anything he's saying is actually correct or not. We know that for a fact because he's made several statements that are just plainly wrong and that are very easy. It's extremely easy to confirm that these statements are wrong. So then Dr. Evans goes on to say, Mark McDonald, the barrister now representing and campaigning for Letby, has been a barrister for 28 years, but he's not a KC, which makes him an ageing junior. Now, this statement makes me believe that people who are desperate to believe that Lucy Letby are guilty have been feeding Dr. Evans' comments, because this is something that I've seen someone else say. Now, it's possible that Dr. Evans has looked them up himself, but I don't think he's internet savvy enough to do that, because these are very obscure people that really, to be honest, no one pays any attention to whatsoever. So I think that it's very likely that someone has been feeding him comments. It's possible that he located this himself. Either way, he's just simply repeating an argument made by someone else previously. And I think it's likely that he's being fed these remarks. If he is being fed these remarks, I hope the people that are doing it can continue to do so, because everyone that is making these remarks are utterly moronic. That there isn't a single person with any credibility whatsoever on the pro-guilty side, and they make the most stupid comments, the most stupid remarks, the most stupid arguments, and they have no credibility whatsoever. So I hope they feed him as much information as possible and he continues to repeat it, because every time he does, he's making himself look more and more and more stupid. So then Dr. Evans has previously made these remarks, and I really want to go over these because it gives context to what he's saying here. So previously Dr. Evans said, Mr. Mark McDonald's observations regarding my evidence should be are, because observations is a plural, Dr. Evans. Mr. Mark McDonald's observations regarding my evidence is substantiated, unfounded, inaccurate. His method of presenting his information reflects clear prejudice and bias. I find his style most unedifying, most unprofessional. It's highly disrespectful to the families of babies murdered and harmed by Lucy Letby. Well, I'm slightly confused here, because now you're getting involved in a slanging match with Mark McDonald, insulting him publicly, and not only that, but your statement is completely irrelevant to the matter in hand. Mark McDonald wasn't present at the event that you're referring to. This is nothing to do with Mark McDonald. This is just something that has been fed to you from online material, or possibly, conceivably, you might have read online, and now you're repeating it, thinking that it does anything other than make you look like a complete idiot. Furthermore, suggesting that Mark McDonald is unprofessional and that he prevents information with clear prejudice and bias. If there's ever been a clearer case of the pot calling the kettle black, then I'd like to know what it was. Seeing as you're the epitome of someone that is prejudiced and biased, and the epitome of someone that is unprofessional. As for being highly disrespectful to the families of babies, I've dealt with this in a previous video. I'm not going to go over that again. And the last statement made by Dr. Evans is, if these people are the best the pro-Letby camp can come up with, it's pretty pathetic. Now, obviously, Dr. Evans is aware that there are already shitloads of neonatologists who disagree with him. But let's just go over the biography of 3 of the international panel. Now, last time it took me 10 minutes to read out the credentials and qualifications of 4 of the panel, so I'm not going to read any of those 4 out again. I'm just going to go over 3 of the panel this time. So let's begin with Dr. Joanne Langley. Dr. Langley is a paediatric infectious disease physician and vaccine researcher at the Canadian Centre for Vaccinology and Professor of Paediatrics and Community Health and Epidemiology at Dalhousie University. She's head of the Division of Paediatric Infectious Diseases, IWK Health. She's an active investigator in the CIHR-funded Canadian Immunisation Research Network and is the co-lead of its clinical trials network. Dr. Langley's research focuses on the epidemiology, prevention, and control of respiratory viruses, particularly influenza and respiratory syncytial virus and other vaccine preventable infections. Dr. Langley formerly was Medical Director of Infection Prevention and Control Services at IWK Health. Her research also focuses on vaccine policy and evidence based immunisation decision making. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she served as co-chair of Canada's COVID-19 task force and as a member of the COVID-19 expert panel for the Chief Science Advisor of Canada. She is currently co-chair of the Council of Expert Advisors to the Government of Canada's Ministries of Innovation, Science and Economic Development and of Health for the development of the Biomanufacturing and Life Sciences Strategy. She is a former member of the Canadian Task Force on Preventive Healthcare and served as Vice and Chair of Canada's National Advisory Committee on Immunisation. Further, she's a Fellow Society of Hospital Epidemiology of America, Fellow Infectious Disease Society of America, Fellow of the Pediatric Infectious Disease Society. Bruno Piedberth, MD, has done his medical school, his paediatric residency and neonatology fellowship at the University of Montreal, already more qualified than Dr. Evans. Already. After completing an additional 3 years in molecular biology at the University of Rochester, he has joined in 1993 the paediatric department at Université Laval and the CHU de Quebec as a clinician researcher, where he practiced neonatology for 30 years. From 2003 to 2012, he was the chair of the paediatric department at Université Laval and the paediatric chief at the CHU de Quebec. And from 2012 to 2017, he was the executive vice dean of the Faculty of Medicine at Université Laval. Since 2009, he's the president of the Table Sectorielle Mère Enfant of the province of Quebec. In 2018, he was appointed director of the University Affairs for the Quebec Ministère de la Santé et des Services Sociaux. With my extremely limited French, I think that means health and social services. His direction is responsible for the planification of the medical resources for the province. He has maintained research activities over the years, and he is currently director of the Reproductive, Maternal and Child Health Research Division of the CHU de Quebec Université Laval Research Centre, and because of his involvement in different administrative functions in the educational and healthcare system, his interest in using evidence-based medicine to improve the organisation of the healthcare system growth, and as I directed his interest in research. He is the new president of the Board of Governance of the Canadian Neonatal Network in the shared aims of improving the organisation of healthcare for pregnant women and newborns while supporting a new generation of healthcare researchers. So I'm only going to do two, actually, because they're throwing French at me now as well as medical words that I can't pronounce. So that's quite enough for me. Anyway, you can just see in those two people that they just massively outrank Dr. Evans. So when he's saying, oh, if that's the best the Letby camp have got to offer, well, no. The Letby camp has got over 50 experts now in the defence, and the neonatologists on display are undeniably at the top of their profession, and they are way above Dr. Evans, not just in terms of their careers in medicine, but also in terms of the positions they've held in these important organisations and their published academic work. There's no comparison. There's absolutely no comparison. Dr. Evans may not wish to face that because he has this enormous and completely disproportionate opinion of himself, but the reality is that anyone with half a brain can see that these people just absolutely wipe the floor with him. There is no comparison, and if there was any justice, this would already be with the Court of Appeal now. They would already be looking at this, and they'd already be moving very quickly on this and saying, well, obviously, with this level of medical expertise compared against what was in the prosecution case, we need to look at this again properly. There needs to be a proper medical investigation into the hospital. Never mind just whether or not Lucy Letby is guilty or innocent, that's obviously very important. But the health outcomes of these children needs to be assessed properly. There's a chain reaction that I've discussed in my previous video of now Thirlwell is going to say all cases need to be referred to the police as soon as possible. That is extremely dangerous. We see why in this case, if we're just going to get expert witnesses in that have retired for 20 years, who are not even proper experts really compared to the standards that is actually required, there's going to be many more bad healthcare outcomes, many more bad legal outcomes, and many more situations similar to Lucy Letby. But really, although it's extremely worrying and disturbing that people can be locked up when they've done nothing wrong, and that's very serious in and of itself, some of the consequences within the healthcare system are equally serious, and you could even argue they're more serious. But regardless of that, this has to be dealt with and it has to be addressed. And these kind of ridiculous, embarrassing throwaway remarks from Dr. Evans that, oh, the Letby camp doesn't have anyone of any substance. Well, they've got people that will just trample all over you intellectually, in terms of their qualifications, in terms of their careers, and you know that. So finally, I want to look at the topic of expert witnesses. Now, it's enjoyable to poke fun at Dr. Evans, but there is a more serious issue at play here, which is he is supposed to be an expert witness, and he's not supposed to be behaving in this fashion. So I just want to read some information about this. I will probably make a standalone video on this topic at some point, because I found some interesting information from the Crown Prosecution Service and also the kind of equivalent body in Scotland. Expert witnesses play a crucial role in the justice system, providing specialised knowledge to assist courts in understanding complex issues. Their duty is to offer impartial, unbiased opinions and evidence, focusing on assisting the court rather than advocating for a specific party. This neutrality is vital for maintaining the integrity of the legal process and ensuring a fair outcome. So, I think anyone looking at this paragraph here, even if they strongly supported the prosecution, would have to conclude that Dr. Evans is not matching this standard. Clearly, Dr. Evans has been very strongly advocating for a specific party continually since the court case ended. When the court case was taking place, it's very hard to assert that he gave completely unbiased opinions and evidence. And considering that this neutrality is considered vital for maintaining the integrity of the legal process, this should be considered extremely worrying. Key aspects of neutrality are objectivity. Expert witnesses must present their opinions and findings objectively without being swayed by the interests of any party. So we already have at least 4 cases where we see Dr. Evans completely failing to do this. Impartiality. They must remain impartial, avoiding any bias towards one side or the other, and ensuring that their testimony is based on evidence and their expertise. Now, Dr. Evans has given countless interviews now. He's been a prolific media commentator in a way that has been in no way impartial and in no way avoiding bias towards one side or the other, which is completely consistent with what he actually did in court. Independence. Experts should maintain independence from the legal strategies and interests of the parties involved. I'm personally very doubtful that Dr. Evans has done this, but this is significantly more debatable. And then the other things are not as relevant to the conduct of Dr. Evans. The importance of neutrality, though, is fairness. Neutral expert testimony helps ensure a fair and impartial resolution of legal disputes. Now, considering what we've seen Dr. Evans do over the last 2 years, the comments that he's made and now continues to make recently, can this reasonably be described as him being impartial? This is extremely important because he's supposed to be neutral in order to result in a satisfactory resolution of what is described here as a legal dispute. Now, obviously, this goes way beyond the definition of a legal dispute. This is an extremely serious thing in the life of Lucy Letby. It's the ultimate penalty. She's facing the stiffest penal sentence a woman has ever faced in Britain since the abolition of the death penalty. So neutrality becomes even more important, and yet we see him behaving in this way that is so inappropriate and frankly completely juvenile. The next thing is integrity. Maintaining neutrality upholds the integrity of the judicial process, of course, extremely important. Credibility. A neutral expert is more likely to command respect from the court and opposing legal teams as their testimony is taken seriously. Objective decision making. Neutral expertise helps judges and juries make informed decisions based on evidence rather than biased opinions. So I'll leave viewers to judge whether or not the behaviour and conduct and general perspective of Dr. Evans is helpful in this goal of objective decision making. Expert witnesses are generally advised against making continuous public comments after a court case. Let me just read that again. Expert witnesses are generally advised against making continuous public comments after a court case. Now, that is really significant in this case because none of the other expert witnesses have said anything. Dr. Bohin gave one very short interview to the BBC where she was much more neutral than Dr. Evans, and no one else has said anything at all. Madrides, literally a couple of sentences to the Times, I believe it was, and nothing else at all. None of the others have said anything at all, and there's no reason for them to do so because they were barely involved in the court case anyway. But it is notable that the other expert witnesses have just made no public comment at all. It's only Dr. Evans who's come out repeatedly and continually, which is literally what they are advised against doing. This comment continues, while they may offer insights in specific circumstances, such as to allay suspicions or clarify ambiguous points, it's crucial to maintain impartiality and avoid acting as a mouthpiece for a particular party. So this is literally exactly what Dr. Evans has done. Literally the inverse of what he's supposed to do. It's crucial for him to remain impartial. Well, he clearly hasn't done that. And it's crucial for him to avoid acting as a mouthpiece for a particular party. Well, he obviously hasn't done that either. And this is just the latest example of him doing exactly what he's not supposed to do. In essence, expert witnesses should be mindful of their role and the potential impact of their words. While they may have valuable insights to share, continuous public comments can undermine the integrity of the legal process and the expert's credibility. It's crucial to focus on providing objective and accurate information within the scope of their expertise and to avoid taking on the role of an advocate. Again, this is almost an inverse description of what Dr. Evans has done. Dr. Evans has done precisely what this comment indicates you should not do. Dr. Evans has not been mindful of his role and the potential impact of his words. Dr. Evans has not avoided continuous public comments which could undermine the integrity of the legal process and his credibility. Dr. Evans has not focused on providing objective and accurate information within the scope of his expertise. Dr. Evans has not avoided taking on the role of an advocate. So I just found this final paragraph from the Crown Prosecution Service, and I won't go over this in depth because it's a really interesting document and I would like to do a standalone video on this document and also a similar document from Scotland. But it just simply states the duty of an expert witness is to help the court to achieve the overriding objective by giving opinion which is objective and unbiased in relation to matters within their expertise. This is a duty that is owed to the court and overrides any obligations to the party from whom the expert is receiving instructions. See Criminal Procedure Rules 2020, Part 19. Now, I would seriously question whether Dr. Evans has done this, but certainly since the court case, he has behaved in a way that is completely inimical to what is expected of him as an expert witness, and I can't see how anyone could possibly disagree with this statement. So that's all I want to say in this video. I've responded quite thoroughly to the comments of Dr. Evans, his latest ridiculous, embarrassing remarks. I don't have anything further to say. I'm not going to do a summary because I think it's pretty clear that he has once again made himself into a public spectacle by making comments that are not only inaccurate, not only have no merit whatsoever, but which are frankly deeply immature.